Welcome to the video series, Is Your Church Ready for Change? My name is Allison Sack. I'm the founder of the 522 group, where our mission is to help churches and nonprofits pursue their purpose in a fruitful way. As I stated in the introductory video to this series, we're starting with the assumption that you, your church leadership, have already gone through the process of prayer and discernment. And through that discernment process, you understand where God is leading your church and the direction that your church needs to change. If you haven't done that yet, I strongly recommend that you do that first and then come back to this video series once you understand what changes need to happen in your church to truly follow God's plan. In this video, we'll walk through doing a change impact assessment, why it's important to do the change impact assessment, and I will also share with you the simplified change impact assessment that I have available for you to download, and how then you can monitor for change saturation and what to do if change saturation begins to happen. In the next video in this series, we'll be covering community myths, and then in the final video, we'll be exploring how to communicate well. With that, let's begin in prayer. Lord God, inspire us through your Holy Spirit, that we may bring glory to your church, its people, and to all the world. In the precious name of your Son, amen. So why should you do a change impact assessment? I mean, you've been leading change within your church for years. It seems to have gone over well. People aren't complaining. And you know what? It just sounds like one more thing to do on top of an already extensive list of things to do. Well, I'm glad you asked, because a change impact assessment helps us to understand how change impacts various groups within the church. And by understanding how people will interact or maybe be affected by the change, whether that's going to be a big change for them or whether it's going to be a small change for them, helps us to create the right environment for change. Because when we understand operational, process, behavioral, skill, and risk impacts, then we can better create communication, which creates a better environment, which helps with change acceptance. And ultimately, as we seek to follow God's plan in our churches, that's what we want, is we want change acceptance, because we're going to need the entire community on board in order to make this change right. The other thing that having a change impact assessment does is it helps you to smooth out any rough edges, right? Helping with that communication where you're saying, you know what, might be a little bit painful in the temporary or short term, but long term, here's where we're going to get to, and it's going to be so much better. But then the other thing that it helps you do is it helps you with decision making. Because if you find by doing that change impact assessment that, you know what, our congregation or our staff is going to be hugely impacted by what's happening here, then that allows you to make better decisions, whether those decisions are to slow down your change, whether those decisions are to maybe pick it apart a little bit, or maybe you might find that because this impact is so great, maybe this isn't the right change for your church in the first place. Maybe it doesn't really align with your mission. Maybe it doesn't really align with where God is leading you. So change impact assessment is a fantastic tool to start thinking about your change before those changes happen, and so that you can better guide your community to be where it needs to be. So let's talk about the impact assessment itself. I've created a simplified change impact assessment for you to take advantage of on my website. There's a link to my website in the description box below. You can purchase more in-depth change impact assessments from a variety of different resources, but I wanted to provide something that was free to you, that you could use at any time, and that would really fit most churches and most circumstances. Now, my caveat for that is if you see substantial or significant change for more than one population group in your church, then I highly encourage you to work with a professional like myself, work with a church consultant who can help you develop a timeline, who can really assess your risks, who can help you create an in-depth communication plan so that that change goes over well. If you're already working with a professional, then I encourage you to make sure that they do a change impact assessment for you. They should be talking with you, your church leadership, your staff, your volunteers, and a subsection of your congregation to understand how those changes may be impacting your church. So, very important, again, as I said before, for change acceptance, to make sure that you're taking into account everything that's happening and how that could be impacting your church. The other critical piece I want to highlight is this assessment should not be assessed in isolation, because if you look at it from a siloed perspective and you're the only one who's filling it out for the entire congregation, you're going to miss some things. And so you want to make sure that you're getting feedback from your leadership. Have them fill it out. Have your staff fill it out. Don't do your whole congregation. That might be a little bit too much, but find a good subsection of your congregation that would be willing to fill it out for you. And then once everybody has filled out this change impact assessment, then you can start to bring people together and compare those scores, because it's in comparing those scores that you're really going to understand how any changes are going to impact those different populations. The other thing that I want to make sure that as you're filling it out is that you take into account what I call spheres of influence. And what I mean by that is, in churches, people wear many different hats, right? I might be a member of the congregation and I might be on staff, or I might volunteer in maybe a staff type capacity and be a member of the congregation. I might be on the leadership team and be a member of the congregation. And so what you want to do is you want to take that highest sphere of influence. And what I mean by that is, if I volunteer in the office, say 3 days a week, then I'm going to fill out that assessment based upon my volunteer perspective. If I'm on the leadership team, I'm part of a leadership council, for example, that's how I'm going to fill out the change impact assessment, because that's the only way that you're really going to see how change impacts these different groups throughout your community. So let's dive right in. I think the easiest way to do this is to walk through a scenario so you can see how this works in practicality. So for our scenario, let's imagine that we've got a church that is looking to offer a second service during the week. The goal is to offer something different than what's happening on Sundays, and maybe provide some flexibility for those folks who can't always attend worship on the weekends. The decision by the leadership team was that this would also provide an opportunity to tap into the wealth of knowledge already available to you in your church, because there's several people within the congregation who hold seminary degrees. That's the basic scenario that you're going to fill out in the space describing what change will occur. The anticipated time frame for bringing this service to life is about 2 months, so fairly aggressive. The leadership council at the church has been praying over this for a while and is now ready to move quickly. It's generally assumed that this will be seen as a positive step for the church, as they haven't done anything like this before, but in the past, there has been a lot of interest in doing something similar to this. So now let's look at how this will affect the processes within your church. For the pastor or leadership team, a new process will need to be created around planning worship services. So that there's some continuity between the two services. This is mostly a communication process. So I put that as a 4 because of the short turnaround time. Now, for the staff and volunteers, based upon our brief scenario, I don't see any new processes that will need to be put into place, but they will need to be informed. So I'm going to put their score for this particular question as a 3. For parishioners or congregants, because they won't need to take on any new processes, I'm going to put that as a 1. Will existing processes need to be adapted or changed? Here, I would say for the pastor or leadership team, it is most likely a yes. Not only is there going to be a shift in making sure that the worship service is ready, meaning who's preaching and when, but there's also going to need to be an adjustment to the existing process to make sure leaders like deacons or elders are at each service. There might be more that would need to change, but based upon this, I'm going to put it as a 4. Since it's mostly a communication process, but again, we've got a limited amount of time. Staff and volunteers will also have to adjust to schedule things for, things for like greeters, parking attendants, audio visual, whatever else needs to happen to make a worship service come together. Plus, I can see that they would need to make adjustments to how announcements are done. Not only how they're done, but the process of submitting those announcements. Not only do announcements need to be ready earlier in the week to account for that midweek service, but also too, there's going to need to be a shift in any work that maybe normally happened on Monday and Tuesday to do the announcements and to get those ready. And that work that was previously done on a Monday or Tuesday would need to shift to later in the week. So I'm going to put this as a 4 as well, since there's going to be some training needed, plus the short turnaround time. Finally, what existing processes need to change for the congregation? Not much. So I'm going to keep that at maybe a 1, potentially a 2 at most. Specific to this change, will any formal training be required? In this particular instance, there isn't any formal training that is required. We won't need to have people go through online training courses or modules in order to move forward. So for this, I'm going to put 1s across the board. So when we put all of our totals together, you can see that we have 9 for pastors and leaders, 8 for staff and volunteers, and 3 for congregants and parishioners. Moving on to operational change. I see very little operational change impacts across the board. And the reason is because we're not making a change to the organizational structure. So operational versus process, operations is really the day-to-day running of any organization, and process is how we run that organization. So we're not bringing on the folks who will be leading the Wednesday service onto staff. So we're not making a change to staff. We're not making a change to decision authority or how decisions are made in the church. And certainly because we're not making those 2 changes, we don't have any training for anybody to do for any operational change. So across the board, I see this as all 1s, making our totals for operational change 3 for pastors and leaders, 3 for staff and volunteers, and 3 for our congregation. So now let's look at behavior change. And behavior change is how we interact with each other and then how we interact as a wider community. Now, for this scenario that we're working through, we are going to see some pretty significant behavior changes, particularly with our pastors and leaders. And what I mean by that is they're really going to have to make sure that the community remains a cohesive community, that it doesn't devolve into, we're the Wednesday people and we're the Sunday people, right? So they're probably going to have to go through some training to understand those community dynamics and how they can help the community to remain together as a whole. And this is critical for the success of the church, right? For the success of the church remaining as one community versus 2 separate communities. So I'm going to rate that one as a 5. Now, for our staff and our volunteers, they're not necessarily going to be interacting with the community differently than they were before. And so for them, I'm actually going to say that this is a 1, maybe a 2 at best in terms of needing to make some kind of behavior changes. But for our parishioners and our congregants, they're going to have some significant behavior changes because they're the ones that we want to keep from devolving into a Wednesday or a Sunday group. And so that's going to take a lot of communication, and it's going to take a lot of upfront communication, and it's going to take a lot of continuing communication throughout the change and even beyond. And so we're going to ask that this community really shifts into a more open mindset as new people join on maybe days that you don't go to church, right? In a very short amount of time. And so I'm going to rate that for our community as being a 4. Now, we don't have any training. We're not going to ask our parishioners to go through any kind of formalized training. We're not going to put our staff through any kind of formalized behavior change training. Even the training that we might do for our pastors and our leaders isn't necessarily going to be formalized training. So I'm going to put that as 1s across the board again. Now, what that will do then in terms of totals is I've got, for pastors and leaders, I've got 6 as a total. For staff, I've got a total of 2. And then for parishioners, I have a total of 5.
Looking at our total numbers then, for pastors and leadership, I have 18. Staff and volunteers, I have 13. And for congregants and parishioners, I have 11. Communication is going to be our biggest avenue for success here. There are some in the community that will feel more impacts in different pockets, and certainly your communication plan will address those. But overall, this is a fairly moderate change for the church.
Now, let's be real. We did not go through all of the permutations or all of the ripple effects that would happen with this particular change. We did not talk about children's or youth faith formation, Sunday school, if you will. We did not talk about, maybe shifting choir rehearsals or shifting youth group nights or shifting committee meeting nights, right? All of those things that really go into the life of a church. We didn't talk about any of those things, but they certainly would have a significant impact on how that change is received. In fact, it could change some 2s or 3s into 4s or maybe even 5s. But in the same vein, if we extended out our timeline and we didn't have such a short timeline of, say, 2 months, and we put that out there as 4 months or even 6 months, well, now some of those 4s and 5s might be shifted down to 3s and 2s. So you can see that you can change how change impacts your community, number 1, by changing your timeline, but then also 2, as you really consider everything that will go into that change. Now, timeline leads us directly into change saturation. So change saturation is exactly what it sounds like. Think of a sponge trying to absorb a significant amount of water in a very short amount of time. Eventually, the water begins to leak out. When that happens, you get resistance to change, and no amount of communication and no amount of training is going to help. The only cure for change saturation is time. You need to give people more time to adjust by slowing down your timeline. Now, there may be times when critical change is needed and it needs to happen fast. At that point, what you need to consider is what's truly critical and needs to happen now versus what can happen later. So how do you know when you're hitting that change saturation point? Well, feedback, feedback, feedback. First, what are you hearing? Are you hearing about too many changes happening? And who are you hearing it from? If you're hearing it from the people that always complain, always give you feedback, maybe you take that with a grain of salt. But if you start hearing it from people who don't normally complain, that should carry more weight. Are you hearing from some of your staff or your leadership group about morale issues? Is there a decrease in engagement? Has your congregation gotten just a little bit more cynical than they usually are? Then they don't understand the reason for change, or maybe they don't understand the reason for the pace of change. These all could be signs of change saturation. The second thing is, what are you seeing? Is there a decline in staff productivity? What about turnover in your staff or your volunteers, or even an increase in no-shows from staff or volunteers? Maybe your leadership team is having a harder time collaborating and moving forward. Again, these could all be signs of change saturation. In a former church, After our longtime pastor retired, we hired an interim pastor. Truth be told, one of the wisest men I've ever met. But after the retirement of the previous pastor, there was an eagerness to make a lot of changes within the church. And that is a natural response to a change in leadership. But this very wise interim pastor instead declared a season of Jubilee for 6 months. So for 6 months, other than absolutely necessary changes, the congregation was just going to celebrate all the great things that we as a community were already doing. This season gave the whole community the space to celebrate and absorb the big changes that had already happened. Resistance was minimized, cynicism was reduced, and volunteer burnout decreased. After that 6 months, then there was a greater openness to making changes. Maybe your church doesn't need 6 months of a Jubilee celebration. Maybe they just need 3. That's okay. It's okay to slow down and have that season of celebration. You don't actually need to wait until the end of all of your changes to make sure that happens. I hope you found this video helpful and you feel more confident using a change impact assessment and understand why it's a critical part of helping your church accept change. I value your engagement. If you would please like or share or join in the discussion in the comments section, that is invaluable to me. As always, I'm here to help. So if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. May God bless you and your church and all the people within it. Go in peace.